But
Great.
for those of you that don't know Paul, we're actually lucky to have him here at Rose Law Group. Literally, one of the only attorneys in the U.S., maybe even in the world, that are really focused on and doing this type of law right now. And so, we're always looking for the next big thing in the world. And certainly, we all know that artificial intelligence is a thing of the future, but how it impacts our clients' businesses and what we can do to help you all and deal with and incorporate and react to the impacts of artificial intelligence are really the things that Paul spends all day thinking about. And so he's the head of our AI, IP, and Web3 department here at the firm. He's got the combination of legal know-how. He's a scientist in his past, and that's what he does. That he combines those talents really to do really exciting stuff. So I'm interested in hearing about this, always learning more about it, and I'll turn it over to Paul and thank him for putting together this presentation, and thank everybody for joining.
Well, thanks very much, Court. Appreciate it. So I won't spend a whole lot of time on my bio here. I'm an IP attorney, but have been focused on artificial intelligence for a little over a decade now, back before AI was a common household phrase, and before anyone knew about things like ChatGPT and some of the other types of generative AI that we're going to talk about. So as just kind of a background, I wanted to see, I don't know if we have the results of this poll, but we wanted to get a general sense of the audience's familiarity with AI. I'm going to assume that this audience is pretty similar to most of the groups that I talk to, where there's a lot of hype, a lot of excitement around it, not a whole lot of information about what it can do. A lot of people are curious, might have played around with ChatGPT, might start incorporating it for some of their work, and some of the more adventurous might start to rely on it. And so what we're going to talk about a little bit today is context in which that's good and context in which that's bad, because as I start talking to companies and groups about AI, what becomes apparent is that it's not widely recognized exactly what AI is, how it works, and what the potential downsides are in incorporating it into your workflow or incorporating it into a commercial setting. So briefly, let's talk a little bit about what AI is. On the screen here is a really, really simplified version of generative AI. On the left-hand side is pre-existing data. In this case, for an image generating AI, we've got pre-existing images, pictures that are associated with words or tokens. Those tokens are ingested into a training algorithm, and in the training phase, that algorithm breaks down the pre-existing materials into its components. For images, it might be shapes, colors, hues, and their relations to one another. For language models, it's going to be words, sounds, and their relation to one another and how they appear. After the algorithm is trained, it goes into the deployment phase. In the deployment phase, the algorithm is more or less fully formed. We'll talk about how there's some retraining issues in a minute, but the algorithm has been trained, and a user comes and provides a prompt, a context to the algorithm, and the algorithm takes that context, runs it through its pre-existing materials, and outputs a composite that it believes has a high probability of being what you are looking for. In this case, you can kind of see visually the combination of the three images on the left and how they came out on the image on the right. And by the way, these are actual images that I used DALL-E, which is ChatGPT 4.0's image generation algorithm to generate. So you can really see visually how these work with this example. Generative AI is what gets a lot of buzz right now, but it's not the only type of AI. You don't have to memorize this slide. I'm going to show it to you again in a little bit when we get back to this. But the point is that there are many different types of artificial intelligence, and AI is kind of it's a catch-all for any system that performs a function that was typically performed by a human. And so some of these are going to be self-driving cars, chess, but a lot of these are the human interaction that we're seeing recently with ChatGPT and the LLMs.
Hey, Paul, let me just stop you really
Yeah.
quickly because we're only seeing the first page of your
Oh,
cover
this
page
isn't
here. So
this isn't going through. Madeline, can
You might
you
have to
take,
share another window.
let's see.
Sometimes Zoom. Okay.
there we go. We see
Is
one that
it?
says
Yeah.
it's not
It's not
perfect at the
perfect.
top.
Okay, so
Okay.
here's what I was showing you. I'll show it to you again. Doesn't matter. But now let's get to some of the issues. And please tell me again if there are any of those other issues. But it's not perfect, much like humans. There are issues with LLMs, with AI, and it's best to recognize what they are. This is an actual conversation that I had with ChatGPT 4.0. I asked it to create an image of a completely empty room with no elephant in it. And this is the result, which, as you can see, is a completely empty room with a small but very clear elephant right in the middle. ChatGPT's response: here's an empty image of an empty room you requested with no elephant or any other objects in it. And you can find all sorts of examples online of people tricking or breaking these LLMs, but really what they're doing is they're finding unexpected results in the language or language quirks. In this case, what you can see that the algorithm is hooking on to that language of an elephant. It doesn't know what to do with it. It doesn't know how to do no elephant and how to portray that. So the only thing it can do is put an elephant there. Interestingly, I was doing the same exercise with a different model, and I used slightly different language. And I said, with no elephant in the room. And the response was 4 images of rooms with elephants very clearly in it. But when I asked that algorithm to remove the elephant in the room, the response I got was interesting. It said, I'm sorry, I interpreted that as the figurative elephant in the room. Here is an actual room with no elephant in it, and it gave me an empty room. So different models have different quirks, and sometimes they're very unpredictable. And those models change with every update, and those quirks change with every update. And so it's a constantly evolving situation that we're trying to understand exactly how AI is working at all times. Here's one of the biggest issues, the in-out issue. And I originally titled this the in-out problem, but the reality is that in some contexts, it's not a problem. It's just the way these algorithms work. And the more that the user and the developers understand that that's how they work, the more that they can be better brought to bear on appropriate circumstances. So the top situation here, the common idiom, garbage in, garbage out. And it's true. As you saw in the earlier, the model is built on pre-existing material. And if that pre-existing material is garbage, it doesn't have a way to create new material. It is just assembling a Frankenstein's monster of the pre-existing material. So if you have garbage in, you're going to have garbage out. Similarly, the output is going to be a reflection of that input. And so if you train it on only one type of input material, on only one type of image, if you say that show it only images of blonde women, the output is all going to be blonde women. It's not, the algorithm is not going to have any other frame of reference to create an output from. Again, good and bad, depending on the circumstance. There are times when you don't want the algorithm to go crazy, where you want it to focus, especially in commercial settings. You might not want it to show other types of products or other types of product configurations. You want it to focus on one type of input. This is why it might not be a problem in some contexts, but it's something to know. The third is a unique instance where the algorithm actually removes something and does change it, and that's the context. These algorithms have a nasty habit of removing doubt from the input, and so things that are input with some context of uncertainty might be, and typically are, output in a very certain manner. I call this the reverse Ron Burgundy. So instead of, I'm Ron Burgundy going in, the algorithm will just strip that question mark off of it, and it comes out with a pure declarative statement. Again, good and bad depending on the context. In many instances, though, it's getting people into trouble because they don't understand that when or if the generative AI is providing a best guess in the form of a declaration, or if it's providing real actual answers based on actual pre-existing material. Three things you'll note that the in-out issue creates or prohibits from the situation. First is new ideas. If a algorithm is solely trained on pre-existing material, it has no mechanism to get new material into it. Now, the output oftentimes does look new because it is a combination of that pre-existing material, but none of the individual components of that can be new because the algorithm has no way to create it. You also don't get any new diversity. So whatever is in the training model set is going to be the representation in the output model set. And finally, criticism. You don't see any of that criticism because the model divorces that pre-existing material from the context in most cases. And so whether or not something is true or false often gets pulled out of the output, and you don't see whether or not there's a high or a low level of confidence. Some products, and this I'll get to in a minute, but depending on the context, some products will give you a confidence interval, how sure it is in that result. And that can be very helpful in a lot of contexts to at least understand the in-out issue and how it's applied. So what are the big things to be wary of in bringing artificial intelligence in, especially in commercial contexts? Model anomalies. So the language quirks. This is like the elephant example. This is becoming to be a major skill that a lot of employees are developing, but prompt engineering is very important, and it can honestly really only be done well by a lot of experience and repetition with a particular model, set of models, in order to understand how they're going to behave. One thing that a lot of people don't understand about the development of these models is that they're a black box even to most of the developers. These models are developed with a series of weightings or weights that can be adjusted and played with in a kind of advanced guess and check to find out what is the most realistic, what creates the most realistic and predictably accurate results. But those weights are themselves, in most cases, a black box. You can't see them as the end user. But even in the cases where you can see them, it's difficult to divine much information about them. They're really just something that you kind of pull the levers until you get a good result. And that results in a lot of anomalies that are hard to predict and hard to understand. Hallucination and confident fabrications. This is what I mentioned about it removes the context of critical thinking, of pros and cons. And hallucinations can be better or worse depending on the prompt. If there are any lawyers or anyone who's followed legal news in the audience, you might be aware of at least 4 or 5 cases now of lawyers turning in briefs with citations that were created by ChatGPT. And when I say created by ChatGPT, I don't just mean that they asked ChatGPT to get this case citations and they weren't the right citations, or they weren't as good as they could have been. They were completely made up cases. The cases did not exist. And to make matters worse, in at least one case where the judge said, hey, attorneys, we cannot find these cases, instead of going to Westlaw and pulling the cases, they went back to ChatGPT, where ChatGPT confidently made up fake case opinions. And they were poorly done opinions. Anyone could tell that they were AI generated if you read very far into them. But the AI is not going to flag those as, hey, I'm making these up. You have to understand by the nature of the tool and the nature of the request what you're likely to get. And in most cases, these large language models are intended to predict what it thinks you want to hear. And so if you ask for it to write a brief that makes a particular argument, it will just cite the cases or cite cases make up cases that look good in that context. However, if you ask it to provide, for example, the legal basis for a particular argument, you might have better results. I'm not saying you're going to get perfect results, but understanding that the question can dictate the nature and quality of the results is kind of step one in using a lot of these tools. To that end, there are other tools that are better suited for particular purposes. Westlaw, a lot of the legal research tools use something called RAG, or retrieval augmented generation. Retrieval augmented generation is where it uses artificial intelligence to understand the nature of the inquiry and then go and retrieve actual facts from a database, in this case, cases or something that is actually been verified as the resulting output that they're looking for. And then the retrieval augmented generation can just regurgitate or serve back up that information that has been already verified. So understanding the nature of the tool and the nature of the purpose is key to implementing AI safely and confidently. Another issue with artificial intelligence, and it's related to hallucination, but sycophancy and confirmation bias. This is where we get into the predictive nature of artificial algorithm or artificial intelligence algorithms. They are trying to predict what you want to hear, and that's not necessarily what you're looking for in certain queries. But the nature of the algorithm is to predict something that can convince you is real and authentic. And so it has a real problem in that when the nature of the prompt indicates a particular type of output, the algorithms will typically push away anything that conflicts with that, and you get this kind of sycophancy of getting the result that you're looking for, not necessarily the actual result. Bias is another related but distinct issue that is primarily related to the training data. And this goes back to the garbage in, garbage out, or you're going to get an output that is the reflection of the material on which the algorithm was trained. In many cases, that's really difficult to articulate or identify, because bias can be introduced, especially in these artificial intelligence servers, in a lot of different ways. One example I like to use is a project that I came across that asked a generative AI to provide 10 images of the most beautiful people from various countries around the world. And it provided those back as kind of an example of what cultural differences were. But it's important to think about all the different sources of bias in that one project. So in just the training data, you've got the original source, the corpus of images that the algorithm was trained on. Most cases, that is sourced open from the internet. But the internet, I think most people have come to understand, is not an authentic reflection of reality. Most people's social media profiles are not an authentic reflection of their life. The world, the internet, is not an authentic reflection of the world, just because there is some degree of self-selection that goes into what gets put online. So the overall the total source of the images is one source. The availability of images from each of those countries is another source of bias that is going to be infecting that project, right? Different countries have different types of demographics that might be more prevalent online, and that difference in prevalence is going to be reflected in the ultimate output. As part of that training, you're also going to have a degree of human interaction, right? Of, who decides what qualifies as a beautiful person. There's subjectivity in there. There might also be some sort of classification that's done on by another AI system. Well, is that AI system trained to recognize all different skin hues and facial characteristics across a wide variety of demographics? Probably not. Again, that AI itself has its own bias. And so you see that there's all these chain of bias that can be introduced everywhere along the way. And finally, you're just going to have some sort of bias in the actual prompt and the selection of the outputs. And so there's a lot of different bias that can be introduced, never more so than when you're using someone else's algorithm that they have weighted various components and had some sort of control over the input material. That's giving up a lot of potential bias to other parties. For this reason, we're starting to see some regulation come down attacking this component of it particularly. For example, New York City itself has a city ordinance now on the books that prohibits using artificial intelligence in certain types of employment decision making, hiring, firing, promotion decisions. And it's for these bias reasons, and it's difficult to control for, especially at this point in time. One of the predictions I do frequently make is that I do think eventually we'll see some services that will try to correct for bias. Maybe we'll see some sort of guaranteed bias-free data sets or servers that can put some sort of quantification on the level of bias in different types. But it's probably one of the biggest issues that is percolating, especially on the government level, in incorporating artificial intelligence into government services. And the last thing to be aware of here, this is kind of an amorphous concept, but something called data drift is going to play more and more of an issue as AI becomes more prevalent. And data drift is kind of a phenomenon where you see it with these recursive loops of the inputs become the outputs from one stage, and then those outputs will eventually become inputs on the next loop of artificial intelligence. Generative AI's biggest source of material is scraping the internet. And so we're quickly becoming, and as generative AI becomes more and more of a presence on the internet and more of the ultimate source for a lot of that material, we're quickly going to devolve into a situation where we just have two AI bots arguing in the comments section of an article, and that's going to then become the training data for the next iteration of artificial intelligence. So drift is something that it's not something that we need to necessarily worry about too much from a consumer standpoint, but it is something that from a commercial and governmental and big picture standpoint, everyone should at least have in the back of their mind. All right, let's get into some of the other nitty-gritty of AI. This is one of my kind of pet subjects of copyright in the age of generative AI. So if any of you have been following along, you might have seen some of this battle that has been percolating in the Copyright Office, or rather the Copyright Office pulling their hair out, trying to figure out how to deal with this new era of AI generated material. Fortunately, though, it's not really a new issue. It's something we've been dealing with for over 100 years now. In the late 1800s, we first dealt with it when the camera was invented, and the Supreme Court was faced with the question of, are photographs subject to copyright? And what the court ultimately said was that the traditional elements of copyright are creativity. They are the determining what the composition of a picture is, what it will look like. And those traditional elements are done in the case of photography by the photographer. The photographer is the one who creates the composition, who in certain circumstances determines the lighting, the lens, the camera settings. Now there's thousands of camera settings, but the distance from the the subject. All of those are subjective, creative determinations done by the photographer. And so the Supreme Court said the camera is not creating something new in these cases. The camera is just faithfully replicating the creative endeavors of the photographer. And therefore, photographs have all the rights and protections of copyright, and it is the photographer who owns that copyright. And that was what we operated under for 150 years, and we still do. That notion of creativity driving. Whoever is the creative source of the material is the owner of the copyright. And in right around 2000, early 2000s, we saw this really put to the test in the image on the left here. So that was an image. Someone dropped their camera into a macaque exhibit at a zoo, I think in Asia somewhere, and the monkey took its own picture, took a selfie, and PETA and other organizations plastered this monkey's selfie all over the internet, made printed up shirts, and made all sorts of merchandise with it. Eventually, that came to an issue that was brought up to the Supreme Court as to whether or not this monkey could be the owner of the copyright, or if not, who owned the copyright to this image here. And what the court said is, well, in this case, the monkey's the photographer. The monkey is the one who exercised whatever creativity, the traditional notions of creativity to generate that material, and so the monkey's the photographer. However, under international law, only humans can be authors of copyright material, so there is no copyright in this image. And that's consistent with pretty much every court that's tackled the issue in every type of context. It's been litigated over texts that were supposedly divinely inspired or written by poltergeists or extraterrestrials or all sorts of things. If it's not a human, it cannot do the creative work of creating a copyright protectable work of art. However, there might be instances in which the AI operates more as a camera, where it is just faithfully replicating or faithfully putting into a fixed medium the author's conception. And what that looks like is still kind of being figured out. Fortunately here, the Copyright Office has only weighed in on it on one real public instance, and that is this instance on the right here of a book called Zarya of the Dawn. In that case, the author went to the Copyright Office with this book. The book was, all the images were generated by a generative AI called Midjourney. So the author did some tweaking to a few of the images, brush it up in Photoshop, things like that. And then added her own text to create a book. And she went and got a copyright registration on this, and then, as we do, went to the internet to brag about how she's the first one to have a copyright on a work created by generative AI. And the Copyright Office said, hold on a second, slow down, we didn't know that. And so they backtracked a little bit, pulled the registration back and said, we need more information about this. And the Copyright Office did an extensive dive into what the author in this instance did to create these works, and found that, okay, the author had exercised creativity in the text. That was her own text. The author had exercised creativity in selecting which images to use. So the selection of images in that particular, in the whole book, was a creative selection and therefore subject to copyright. But the individual images, the author simply put in a prompt into Midjourney. Midjourney comes up with 4 images based on that prompt. You can select one to serve as a new prompt, or you can select one and do some additional post-processing work on it. But that's kind of the extent of the control that the author exercised to create this image on the right-hand side here. Using a prompt, iterative process, not much else. The court said, well, that's not good enough. In that case, in Midjourney, the system, the generative AI, is actually doing the creative work there. You're just selecting something, and well, you might have done some creativity with the post-processing, but you didn't detail that enough for us to say that you get a copyright. No copyright in the images here. You can only have a copyright in the text and the selection of those images. I now have on the screen here a screenshot of what Midjourney looks like on the left-hand side. So you can kind of get a sense of it. Or you just put in a prompt and you get these 4 images that look pretty similar and you select which one you like the best. That's the entirety of the workflow. Well, court in China, the Beijing Copyright Office had the opportunity to look at this same issue, applying the same creativity standard that is used the world over, and reached a different outcome because of a different workflow used to generate those images. So on the right-hand side, you'll see a different generative AI program. This is one of the workflows for a program called Stable Diffusion. And as you can see, there's just a lot more ability for the user to control what the output is going to look like in Stable Diffusion. And Stable Diffusion, along with a few other types of generative AI, uses other types of filters and add-on tools to provide a lot of control over the final material, the final output, and the ability to kind of go in and change little components of it and really add in some very specific creative work. And the Beijing Copyright Office looked at this and looked at what the author in that case did and said, you know, this is good enough to meet that standard. This is enough that the author was essentially creating the image in their head, preconceiving it, and then using the tools here to generate that in a final visual form. But the creative aspect of it was done by the author in the author's mind, and therefore it is worthy of copyright protection. We're going to start to see a lot more of this play out as this type of dichotomy and more users start to adopt these more advanced tools that give them more control. So while right now the answer is that in most contexts you have to disclaim and disclose and disclaim any work that is generated by artificial intelligence when you are getting a copyright registration. You have to make the Copyright Office aware of that. And you are automatically, based on the Copyright Office's current rules, you're presumed to not have a copyright in all of that material. However, I think more and more people are going to take their process to the Copyright Office and say, look, I really should get a registration in this image, and here's why. And I think they're going to be successful, and we're going to see more and more law develop on that, and that's going to enable more and more of these tools to be deployed in commercial settings where it's critical that companies have and own the output that they're creating, because you can see in these instances, if you don't own the book, there's not a lot of incentive to create it in the first place, because it's too easy for it to be stolen by others, and there's no mechanism for you to protect it if you have no copyright, or there's reduced opportunities to protect it. You can still protect it in some other types of IP, but that's beyond the scope of this discussion. So let's now talk about how do we bring AI into business context, because whether you know it or not, whether you like it or not, workers are already using AI, and they're using it in a wide variety of circumstances, for good and bad. I talked to a lot of C-suites and business owners who are afraid of this, and I talked to a lot of C-suites and business owners who are doing it themselves. Some of them to not great effect. I've seen a lot of contracts written by CEOs who don't think that they need a legal department or a marketing department. And it turns out that they don't own the output that they're paying for or the software that they're about to deploy. And so over-reliance in a lot of business contexts can be fraught with issues. At the same time, AI has a tremendous potential to reduce the most tedious tasks from employees' workload. Generating drafts of emails should not take much time when you can have a system do that. So there are lots of instances where AI should be brought, and it's not really the right answer for C-suites to just say we're not going to deal with AI because it's too hard. Well, you're going to be left in the dust. You're going to be lost to a workforce and competitors who know how to leverage AI to lower their costs, to increase their productivity, and to make better products. And so, I think it's kind of solidifying, at least in the AI expert community that I talk a lot in, that AI is not coming for most people's jobs right now, but people who know how to use AI tools are. AI is not coming for lawyers' jobs right now, but lawyers who know how to use AI are coming for lawyers' jobs. Marketers who know how to use marketing AI are coming for marketing jobs. Artists, everyone who knows how to deploy AI for their purposes are going to have a leg up in the next phase of the digital economy. And that's just kind of the way it naturally has always shaken out. And it's not going to be any different in the AI economy. So they're already starting to use it. It behooves all businesses to accept that reality and approach this from a how do we integrate AI, not whether. So they're using it already for some text, image, audio, and video generation. I don't have exclamation points on this one, but I probably should, because depending on the context, that's either great or terrible. If they're an assistant using it to draft AI or emails or letters, great. Don't waste person time on things that can be more easily done. But if you're using that to create advertising or actual work product that you're selling to customers, if a lawyer is using that to create work product that they are sending out without creating or double checking that and doing the actual work that they were hired to do on top of that, that's very bad. So understanding how these tools are best used and best deployed and making sure that they are only used in those contexts is kind of step one. Another one that is increasingly common, and we see this more and more, it is software code generation. And if you don't know, software code is protected by a lot of the same tools that other types of text are protected by, namely copyright. To some extent, you can use trade secret, but that's not great when we're talking source code protection. So code that is generated by artificial intelligence is subject to the copyright generation issue that I just mentioned. So if you're using code and incorporating it into a final product, you might not own significant portions of that software, the final product that is created. And if you go to register that software with the Copyright Office, as you should before you deploy it, otherwise, you risk getting it ripped off for a variety of reasons and forfeiting some very strong protections. So if you go to register that software and don't disclose and disclaim the AI generated material, your registration is not valid. Because you are under an obligation to educate yourself as to whether that material exists and disclose and disclaim it if it does. There are, I'm going to get to this in a little bit more detail in a second, but there are methods to mitigate that issue. A lot of that comes into just the way you have your workflow set up. So in some instances, for example, if you're using AI to generate backgrounds on images, but are creating characters, and that's your main core product. Common in a lot of instances, already Wizards of the Coast got caught doing this. They create a game called Magic the Gathering, got caught using generative AI for some of their advertising. But if you're going to use this to create the background and have human-generated characters that are in the foreground, you can do all of the human-generated work first. Get a copyright registration on that, not even have to mention the AI stuff because it's not part of that image. then layer on the AI background in the end. And that is, even though the non-background edition might never see the light of day, might never be public, that's the only version that is copyright protected directly. The version with the AI has some protections because it is a derivative work of the registered version. And so you can obtain some registration benefits of AI generated material just simply by changing around some of the workflow and not adjusting any other aspects. Workers are already using AI for data analysis, good and bad. Great in that AI can provide some unique analysis, but if that's not a sanctioned activity, that you have an enterprise level agreement or license with that AI vendor, there's a strong possibility that that vendor is taking any data that you provided and using it to retrain their algorithm. So if if workers are using AI for data analysis, there's a possibility that they're also leaking proprietary information that is going to show up in that algorithm's future output, or at the very least, could destroy some of your protections and possibly violate other agreements or duties of confidentiality that you have in that data. Translation and summarization, that's an excellent use for AI, honestly, for current applications. One note, summarization, it's not perfect. Go ask ChatGPT 4.0 right now how many R's are in strawberry, and I bet you're going to get the answer 2, even though there's 3. It's not perfect even in counting simple things, but it can do tasks that are well suited for it, like summarizing large volumes of data that can later be checked by human. Translation, if you don't need a perfect translation, it is really good in those instances. Leads management and customer communication. This is another instance that people are starting to use AI more and more. It can generate draft emails based off a user's interaction with a chatbot on your website, and can have a customized interaction based on some of the other data that you know about that. AI is really good at bringing together lots of data points, and so things like lead management, human interactions, and chatbots and stuff like that are great applications for current generation of AI tools. So I mentioned that I'm going to get back to this. These are the 7 types of seven types of AI that have been identified by a group called Cognilytica. Excellent group that does a lot of thought leadership in the AI space. They've got a great podcast that I listen to a lot as well. A lot of information on this, but just quickly, I'll tell you about these 7 types. But what you see more often, and what we're going to see, is that more tools are really a combination of these different types of AI. So just going around, starting at the top and going around clockwise manner, goal-driven systems. These are kind of single-purpose vehicles. Think Deep Blue in the 80s and 90s that could play chess really well. It learns one function really well in a particular system. And you might have goal-driven systems that are kind of a combination of these, but that's what a goal-driven system is. Predictive analytics, that is where you take a past history, use it to predict the future. Really cool applications for things like industrial maintenance, figuring out when a filter needs to be changed based on past usage, and being able to do that before the filter breaks down. You can achieve a lot of efficiencies and cost savings just by using some predictive analytics. Human interaction, that's what most people are probably most familiar with. Large language models, chatbots, the current wave of human interaction. I think that we're probably going to get to a place where a lot of these types of AI systems are just going to have a human interaction AI built on top of it. So, I mentioned retrieval augmented generation earlier. That is basically a search algorithm, search engine with an advanced human interaction AI bolted onto the top that you interact with, and that's all you see. Autonomous systems are exactly what they sound like. These are autonomous cars. If you're in Phoenix, you see Waymo driving around. That's an autonomous system that can learn and intend to react without additional human input. Pattern detection, this is identifying patterns that humans are not very good at, seeing the pattern in the white noise, identifying characteristics about your customers or your vendors or your data stream or your stream of goods that you might not be able to see just by using the naked eye. AI systems are really good at seeing those subtle patterns. Recognition and classification is another type of system. Think just pattern recognition of an image and saying what type of food it is. AI is uniquely adapted to that. And lastly, hyper-personalization. This is where I was talking about the marketing leads, where you can take an individual's interaction with a chatbot. Maybe you know some additional information about them, such as their location that you get from IP address or other information from their browser cookies, things like that. You combine those pieces of information and you can create kind of a hyper-personal profile of the person that you're working with. AI is really good for that. There's new kind of features with some of these AI products that allow you to intentionally program a memory into it. You can tell ChatGPT to call you by a particular name and things like that. That's the type of hyper-personalization that these AI systems can achieve. How things can go wrong. This list is so long, but there's only 3 of them up here. It can go wrong in so many ways that I've talked a lot about, but these are some big ones in the news. The deep fake was an interesting one, essentially a Zoom call with a live deep fake version that was basically a digital avatar that a scammer was using that looked like the CFO, or at least well enough that an assistant got a $25 million wire transfer in the works before they figured out that there was something fishy with the video call. More not concerning, but this is lucky that it happened on a small scale, but Canada Air deployed a chatbot, and the chatbot was giving out kind of bad information, I think particularly about grief discounts or discounts for family members who have recently passed away. And that was built on false policies that were not Canada Air's actual policies, but the chatbot offered these particular discounts, and they went to court, and the court said, look, if you deploy something to act on your behalf, to speak on your behalf, you are subject to the things that it says. You own it. So you own those deals that it strikes. So that's something certainly to consider, especially when deploying chatbots, and whether or not you want to put some guardrails around the things that it can ask. A lot of people have just been, pulling ChatGPT, different GPTs, custom GPTs that people have made, putting them on their website, and customers are finding out that they can query these things for information about just about anything and have it do their homework without paying for the $20 a month that they would normally have to fork over. So deploying some of these tools in a thought out manner is critical so that you don't get caught in some of these instances. And another high profile one, New York City released a chatbot that was similarly giving bad advice, that in this case was actually advising small business owners on how to break the law and get away with it. And so that was spotted and taken down very quickly. But it's important when deploying any of this technology that it be well tested, and that you put in a program to catch and filter out any of those issues with the deployment. Right now, Maricopa County courts have a chatbot that they have deployed and are in the process of iteratively figuring out how to reduce the human interaction. But right now, every interaction is recorded and reviewed by a human, and certain interactions are automatically elevated for human intervention. And that's kind of critical at the early stages of deploying these technologies is doing it in a way that you can catch these issues and make sure that they are caught in a way that does no harm. And as we've seen, there are plenty of examples in ways that wasn't done and damage that it can do. So before I get to, I see that we've got a couple of questions, and feel free to toss them in the chat or Q&A as we go along. I'll try and answer as many of them as I can toward the end. But I want to give some overall guidelines to what you should be thinking about when bringing AI in, especially in a commercial setting. This one I'm going to go through really quickly because building AI projects is not very common right now, mostly because of cost. People do not or vastly underestimate how much it costs to train these AI systems. ChatGPT was several $billion to train the current iteration, billion with a B. It's going to cost, I think he's asking for like $7 trillion to train the next iteration of large language models. It is incredibly expensive. It takes a lot of compute power, takes a lot of energy and other resources that are incredibly taxing for most entities. So building new projects from the ground up is fairly rare. Three things that you do need to think about, though, if you're going to do it: the source of the training data, your rights to it. Do you own that data? Do you own the right to do what you want to do with it? What's that data look like? Breadth and depth. If we're talking about, let's say, people, breadth is how many people do you have in your system? How far does that system reach, that data set reach? Depth is how much data, how much information do you know about each person? And calibrating the breadth and depth to the project is important in order to minimize cost overrun and focus in and create the best possible product. Also, bias. I talked a lot about how bias can get introduced. If you're building an AI project, you need to be thinking about that. The algorithm's the next major component. Do you build the algorithm from scratch? Again, very, very expensive. Or do you license it off the shelf? Pros and cons. If you license it, you're going to be subject to a license agreement with the owner of that algorithm. What that license agreement looks like: open versus closed. I was actually in a call just prior to this versus about what open versus closed versus open source versus closed source means. And the reality is that it's a wild west kind of in the AI world. And so you have to look at both of those. Open source versus closed source might mean, do you have access and visibility into the weighting? Do you have control over which version you are running, which model version you're running on, so that when they update their model, it doesn't change your whole product? Open source open versus closed could also mean whether the data is constantly being fed into the model and it's constantly being retrained. Is it being retrained on outside sources? Is it being retrained only on your inside source? All of those are considerations for how the algorithm is going to be controlled. And then your rights to that algorithm. You don't have commercial rights to a lot of these commercial algorithms. That is, you might not have the right to sell a product built using some of these off-the-shelf AI algorithms. And so you need to make sure that your use matches your rights to that algorithm. And then when you go to implement it, you need to think about things like consumer transparency, notifying the customer that they're interacting with an AI chatbot, or that their data is going to be fed into a particular AI, giving them opt-out provisions. Implementing an employee AI policy. That's the last thing I'm going to mention in a minute here. But making sure that as an organization, you have guardrails around what is proper use of AI and what is not proper use of AI, so that everyone from the C-suite down to the assistants, register clerks, and people doing the frontline work understand what they can use, what they can't use, and when they need to escalate a question about a particular use to someone else. And data security is always something to think about. Your customers' data, how that's being used, what the outside vendors can do with it based on their license, what they do with it, the applicable security that it's subjected to, whether things are encrypted in transit, encrypted at rest. All of those are important considerations, especially when we're talking about commercial data. More critically, you need to be thinking about a lot of these things as well as you're evaluating AI platforms. You really need to think of all of those things that I just mentioned, but in the shoes of the person you're hiring, or the organization, the vendor that you're hiring. How is that AI trained? Do you need to confirm, in some cases, you might need to confirm that vendor has the legal right to that data. If you're going to be using it to, for example, generate commercial images, you might want to be sure that you're using a generative AI that has been guaranteed in writing to you, the customer, that it's only been trained on licensed photographs or licensed material. Those types of things are critical when you're evaluating vendors. Looking at what happens to your data after you transmit it to them. Again, is it going to be safe when it's transmitted? It's going to be safe when it's in the vendor's hands. Is the vendor going to be able to use it to retrain their algorithm? And all of those things should then be memorialized, especially in high value software agreements, should be memorialized in what we call a DPA, a data protection addendum. That's an addendum to a SaaS agreement or any sort of software agreement that says, this is the data, this is how it will be protected, and any violation of this is a material violation of the agreement. And lastly, always want to be thinking, especially in commercial settings, how can you use the output? Because you need to be sure that you own that output and that you have the right to do with it whatever it is that you're trying to do. Are you going to use it as a basis for another work? Well, you need derivative rights. Are you going to use it as a basis of a commercial product? You need commercial rights. Are you going to import it? You might need to import rights. All of those things are part and parcel of the evaluation that needs to be done now when you're thinking about using vendors that use any sort of AI. And by the way, that's pretty much all software vendors from now going forward. So you need to be thinking about this when looking at any software agreements. Last thing I want to talk about is corporate AI policies. These are increasingly important. These are critical for every type of company, in my opinion, to put in place. Everything from a software development company to a restaurant to museums to law firms need to have in a corporate AI policy that is intended to mitigate the risk that I've talked about here, to ensure that the AI is used in a way that is consistent with the company's competency, expectancy, and requirements, and be sure that product quality doesn't suffer. Also be certain that employees aren't feeding proprietary sensitive content, whether it's the company, the organization's own content, or your customer's content, into an open AI system that is going to allow that content to potentially leak or be used by malactors. Lastly, company values and public relations. A few companies have already got caught in hot water saying, promising, hey, we're not going to use generative AI. We're only going to use, human-made artwork for certain things. And they got caught using generative AI because there's certain telltale signs, and that can be problematic for the company's values or public relations. The key components to an AI process, it's something that I can help you develop if you don't have one, but starts with discovery. Understand how you are going to use AI, what types of systems you want to incorporate into your workflow. That is done in a discovery phase before you do anything else. You need to understand what you're going to do with it and what kind of uses you're going to bring AI to bear. Then you need to set a role-specific policy. What someone can use ChatGPT for is different based on their function. An accountant should not be using that to verify certain accounting principles, but an assistant using ChatGPT to generate a draft email is okay. So setting role-specific policies is critical in having an AI policy that is effective. And then lastly, deployment and training. This is an ongoing process. You need to have a group or at least an individual, but preferably a group of people who are responsible for evaluating and vetting AI tools, and updating the AI policy and workplace procedures to work with the AI as it's implemented. So that's all that I had. I see that I'm right at 1 o'clock. So if there are any questions, feel free to drop them in the Q&A, and I'll try and get to as many as I can here. So the first one, seeing for any of us in our respective specialties, how would you recommend going about using ChatGPT, et cetera, to help write blog posts, write a book that we want to copyright? So it really does depend on your respective specialty, how and whether you incorporate ChatGPT into your workflow. So specifically, like, let's talk about writing blog posts. I would not have ChatGPT or any other generative AI write the initial draft of a blog post for a number of reasons. You're looking for certain types of authenticity. You're looking for certain types of unique qualities in a blog post that generally LLMs don't do a good job of bringing in. Like I mentioned, there's not a lot of unique, or there can't be any new material. And that means that there's not a lot of unique material. And so in an output that you want there to be unique material, that's not a very good starting point. Using other types of, let's say, lighter-handed AI, for example, Grammarly is a type of generative AI. Grammarly is not considered to be generating new material, at least in its lightest form. And so that would be an okay tool to use to review, a blog post or an email that you write for tone, quality, consistency, things like that. That is an okay example of use. Writing a book, if you want to copyright it, don't use it to write the book, at least not the text of the book. I do see a lot of authors using AI to help them come up with plot points or to generate scene dialogue or things like that, where the author just kind of needs a little bit of help to get over a stumbling block, and they're using the LLM to just push them through that. That's a great example of it, but you want to be very careful in how much of that you use whole cloth, because as I mentioned, if you do incorporate even a whole paragraph, you have to disclose and disclaim that when you go to register your book in front of the Copyright Office, or you risk invalidating that copyright. So understanding when your AI uses rise to that level is pretty important. I have a couple of clients who I really just do that work for them. Is every couple of months they'll come to me and say, hey, is this okay? And that's something you really want to be confident in, is making sure that if you are producing work that you intend or believe is copyright protected, you want to make sure that your use of AI is well considered and only used in instances in which you're not using it to generate creative work. A couple other instances, just to get some other examples out there. I see people using ChatGPT to, as I mentioned, like generate contracts and things like that. Honestly, it's not a bad place to start. If you're a lawyer and you want to have ChatGPT or something generate a contract that you are going to then take and bottom to top rework, just like most lawyers do with a lot of agreements of that type, again, that's an okay application of ChatGPT or generative AI. But you've got to do it carefully and with a high degree of oversight. It's not something that you can just like let loose. Like I've said, I've seen several clients come to me and say, hey, we've been operating under this agreement. We think it's okay, but we just had ChatGPT write it. Can you take a look at it? And I'm like, yeah, it's fine. It works out okay, but you're not going to own the software. If you're okay with that, then that's fine. That turns out to be a big issue for a lot of clients. Surprise. So, I guess my salient point is understand what it is and don't over rely on it for creating output. If you've been hired to produce something, don't use generative AI to produce that output. That is a bad use. All right, I see another question here. So in Midjourney, we can see everyone else's generated images. True. So Midjourney, for those who aren't familiar, basically it operates off a Discord server, and you can see for most part anyone else's. Are there automatic protections for those images, or are we allowed to download or alter our own for our own purposes? Like I said, the Copyright Office has said, and this is specific to Midjourney, as a matter of fact, that that tool, especially with the author's description of it, but I'm not familiar with any add-ons to Midjourney that would change the fundamental principle here. But any of the output from Midjourney is not protectable by copyright, meaning that no one owns that. It does not mean, by the way, this is another common misconception, doesn't mean that that output cannot infringe someone's copyright. So it is possible that you're downloading from other people's created images on Midjourney that could infringe someone's copyright. There are a lot of reasons why I don't think that that's likely or realistic. I don't have time to get into that here, but generally speaking. So the short answer is you can see everyone else's images. Those images do not have copyright protection. None of those users can come after you for infringing their copyright that in creating the image. However, it's not necessarily carte blanche to use those images in any situation. There could be instances where it's going to create something that is protected by another person's copyright, or more likely probably another person's trademark, where certain commercial instances are going to be prohibited. So it's not carte blanche, but you can generally feel I think a little bit better about using those types of images because you know that at least that output is itself not copyright protected. I feel pretty good, for example, about using images that I have generated on these tools, so long as I've used a generic prompt, a highly generic prompt, like the first example that I gave with the sloth, the skier in the extreme mountains. Those were actual images that I generated, and I have no qualms in using those because I don't think that anybody could reasonably maintain a copyright infringement suit based on the genericness of my prompts. So I know that's a long and convoluted answer to say it depends, but that's kind of the state of copyright and generative AI. All right, so I think that that's the end of the current questions that we have. My email is up on the screen. You can also always contact me on LinkedIn. Feel free to reach out and send a connection request if you have additional questions or would like additional information on AI, generative AI and copyright, or other types of intellectual property, or incorporating AI and AI policies into your business. Please don't hesitate to reach out to me at pcoble@roselawgroup.com. Thank you all for your time. It's been a pleasure talking to you.